And the first one I've done, we did justice in God himself, how he is the source of justice. Then we thought yesterday about justice in the church, about how his people embody justice in their life together. In some ways, that, of course, connected with what John was just saying in our last session about how the church becomes this kind of outpost of true justice in the world, an attractive community because of the justice it displays, reflecting God's justice. But John then kind of hinted at, leant towards, dabbled in, what does the church do for the world? And at the very least, I take it, we are an attractive community that then kind of challenges what the world is doing. But the question we're facing today is justice in the world. What does the church do or not do in engaging with the world directly? How much is that part of our mission? Just think of some of the variety of things churches might do that could fall under that heading. I just noted down food banks, debt counselling, jobs clubs, English classes for different groups, maybe particularly refugees, pregnancy counselling centres, work against sex trafficking, rehousing the homeless, promoting fair trade, campaigning for right to life, and I could have gone on and on. It's a long and a varied list. And of course, you just need to recognize the variety in the room. Some of you might be going, what a great list! Let's do all of it. And others of you might be going, I'm not sure if we should be doing this sort of stuff. It's going to take over from evangelism and so on. That's something of the variety, okay? So the first question is whether we do any of it. If we do, which might we want to do, on what basis and to what end? And in just listing those questions, if you know anything about this topic, I've just opened up several cans of worms and spilt them together. It's more complicated than our previous two topics. It intersects with other theological areas which I can only comment on briefly, things like how we see church and wider society relating. And it's even more complicated by recent understandings of social justice in the world. It's more complicated and it's more contested, and there's more variety amongst us as to how it will actually work out. And so my aim is different today to the last two sessions. My aim is not to sort of argue for a position or just to go, this is true, so we do this. My aim is to show you something of the territory so that you can navigate it better yourself, so that you know what some of the key landmarks are and can think how we're going to position ourselves and where we'll go. And can I just say, as we'll have some time for comments and etc., you know, the FIEC has no one position on this. We're expecting variety. Let's speak and listen humbly to each other in it. I think it'd be helpful to have some background. First, it's just worth saying there is a long history of social involvement. John mentioned earlier the early church onwards. Care for the poor, for abandoned children, caring for sick in plagues, and so on. John quoted the Roman ruler called Julian the Apostate, who said they not only support their own poor, but ours as well. So there's a long history. If we jump ahead in our history, though, in the 18th and 19th century, I think there was of a particular point of engagement by evangelicals. There were a whole variety of things under different headings. I mean, for example, you may not know of this, but there's a thing called the Reformation of Manners movement. It's a rather quaint heading now, but it was seeking to promote morality. It was against drunkenness, prostitution, various things. Lots of evangelicals involved in reforming of society. The Sunday school movement When we think Sunday school, we tend to think teaching kids. The Sunday school movement was basically an education movement. It was promotion of good education in society, run by many churches. We will all know of Wilberforce and the campaign against slavery. Also 19th century, William Booth started the Salvation Army. You know, his 3-word summary of what they were about: soup, soap, and salvation. You've got to feed them, clean them up, and tell them the gospel. Lord Shaftesbury and campaigning against working conditions, you know, kids up chimneys and all of that sort of stuff. In the mission field, and someone like William Carey goes to a place called Serampore in modern-day India, but translates the Bible, does evangelism and so on, and campaigns against various cultural practices, including that wives would throw themselves on the funeral pyres of their husbands. It's a practice called sati. You burn yourself when your husband dies. And he said, no, as a Christian mindset and view of the world, that is wrong and it should not be happening, and culture should not pressure you into it. So particular points of engagement of a whole variety of sorts. But then the early 20th century saw the rise of what is now called the social gospel. It was in response to a number of factors: industrialization, urbanization, immigration, which have then resulted in, particularly in cities, poverty, poor housing conditions, alcoholism, poor working conditions and practices, and so on. A couple of examples of this. A guy called Charles Sheldon published a book called In His Steps, What Would Jesus Do? It's actually a novel at a very popular level about a church faced with things like someone impoverished, sleeping on the streets, alcoholic, etc. And the pastor of that church started to ask the question, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus get involved with social deprivation? And the answer was yes in that book. And it was quite influential. But then there was a more sort of academic level of engagement, and particularly a guy called Walter Rauschenbusch. He wrote a number of things, but particularly A Theology for the Social Gospel, arguing that God was concerned for social injustice and oppression, often linking it with the prophets in the Old Testament. Very influential in lots of ways, not least actually on Martin Luther King Jr., who cites him as an influence. Here is a quote. Follow with me. The social gospel is the old message of salvation, but enlarged and intensified. The individualistic gospel has taught us to see the sinfulness of every human heart and has inspired us with faith in the willingness and power of God to save every soul that comes to him. But it has not given us an adequate understanding of the sinfulness of the social order and its share in all of the sins of all individuals within it. It has not evoked faith in the power, in the will and power of God to redeem the permanent institutions of human society from their inherited guilt of oppression and extortion. So you see the old message, which he also calls the individualistic message, salvation from sin. Doesn't deny that. The new message, he says, is that plus. It's enlarged and intensified. It adds now the sinfulness of the social order and then the power and will of God to redeem the social order itself, its institutions and functioning, societal sin, structural sin. But you may well know that while this, at least in that quote, started as an enlargement of the gospel, it became a divergence from the gospel and even a dismissal, eventually, of the gospel. Individual salvation got lost, and the social gospel became change society, not preach Jesus and his cross and resurrection. And so amongst evangelicals, the social gospel became a negative term because that's what the package was. Later in the 20th century, there was, I think, an increase in social concern by evangelicals, wary of the social gospel, but still saying, no, we should be engaged. And probably the most clear example of this is in the Lausanne Covenant. So it was in early 1970s, the International Congress on World Evangelism. John Stott was very influential, Billy Graham, and so on. Here's part of their statement from the Lausanne Covenant. We affirm that God is both the creator and the judge of all. We therefore should share his concern for justice and reconciliation throughout human society and for the liberation of men and women from every kind of oppression. Here too we express penitence both for our neglect and for sometimes having regarded evangelism and social concern as mutually exclusive. Although reconciliation with other people is not reconciliation with God, nor is social action evangelism, nor is political liberation salvation, nevertheless we affirm that evangelism and socio-political involvement are both part of our Christian duty, for both are necessary expressions of our doctrine of God and humankind, our love for neighbour and our obedience to Jesus Christ. There's probably a classic example of affirming we still believe in evangelism, proclamation of Jesus, but we think it's part of our Christian duty to be engaged in society and working for various forms of liberation or justice and so on. And so while there was an increase, I think, towards the end of the 20th century in various ways amongst various churches, others, though, would disagree. And I still remember, probably late 80s, 90s, if someone raised something in church life and said, oh, we ought to do something about the homeless people down the road or whatever, someone would say, that's just the social gospel. And others would go, but we care for them. In the 21st century, more recently, there's been the rise of what is often termed social justice. And I use the inverted commas because it's a rather nebulous term and it's come to capture lots of things. One writer I read said, it's social justice now is everything that everyone already thinks is good and you couldn't possibly argue against. The term itself is actually quite old, but it's become now this catch-all phrase, and it would include things like things I've mentioned already, poverty, housing, and so on, impoverishment, but it now has included issues around race, gender, sexuality. It's become part of the kind of cultural language. One example, the UN now have a World Day of Social Justice. And it's a term that can, not necessarily, but can hold within it a whole variety of other stuff, like critical theories, like critical race theory. Critical theories examine relationships between people on the basis of power, usually identifying victims and oppressors, and how that works out in society, and particularly in structures of society. Critical theories. Intersectionality, which is seeing how people and groups of people can have multiple factors to do with them that intersect, so they are of a particular race and of a particular gender, and that intersection results in a particular experience, usually to do with oppression and power and so on. Unconscious bias. where we are blind to the power and the privilege that we have. So we're told in some circles, you can be racist without knowing it. Because you're not a racist because of personally bigoted type views. You're a racist because you're not aware of the privilege that you have, and so you unwittingly perpetuate an unjust system. And then fourthly, the systemic nature of this, the nature of systems and structures and institutions. The problem in social justice here is less located in individuals and more in systems. So we talk about systemic racism. And you may know that a fair bit of that stuff arises from a Marxist background. And what was applied to kind of economics, there's injustice over money and resources, and you have to overthrow the capitalist system. That kind of idea is then applied to race, gender, and so on, and we have to overthrow an oppressive system. Now, do you see the territory we've just covered? We've gone from, someone's homeless, should we have concern for them and do something about it, to this stuff. And all of that's coming under the banner social justice now in different ways. And this has then been a great source of contention, particularly within the church in the US and particularly over race. We can't, there will be a whole new seminar to unpack all of that. I'm going to make a few comments later on. Probably just worth saying that within that debate, I think all evangelicals would want to disagree with lots of stuff in that social justice heading, but many would point out there are elements of truth along the way, and Tim Keller probably would have been the person most vocal in that, and picking out what we should be learning and how we should be engaging and how that social justice agenda, rightly understood, modified, changed, etc., should be the agenda of the church, and others rejecting it completely and saying biblical justice is nothing to do with that new social justice. And books on the mission of the church and saying the mission of the church is evangelism and discipleship, and it's not this. There's some background, and there's a lot of complexity. And we're not going to deal with all of that, but I thought it might be helpful just to sketch where we've got to, as I've understood it. That's a simplification. I know it's more complicated. I hope it's helpful. Let's jump on to think about some terminology. Just to clarify, when we say justice in the world, so what are some of the things we might mean? How might we start to divide some of that stuff up? This isn't perfect, but it's the best I can do. We might think of social relief, sometimes called social care, provision for those who are in need. Relief relieves need. So you're caring for people in that way. Social rehabilitation, sometimes called social development. You don't just meet an immediate need, you rehabilitate someone, you help them live differently so that they are not in need or in less need. You help them establish their life in some way. Social reform, sometimes called social justice, where you change the functioning of society and the structures of society. I take an example, take the issue of poverty, someone struggling financially. Under social relief, you might do a food bank. Under rehabilitation, you might provide debt counselling or budgeting help. Under social reform, you might campaign for a higher minimum wage or against payday loans or something. Now, we can argue about what might fall into which category, but that's something of the spectrum. And the reason I think it's helpful to see that is we might think there are biblical arguments for some of those, but not for others. And so when someone says, I believe in social justice, one of the first things to say is, what do you mean by that? Which of these are you arguing for? Some of us might think there's an argument for all of them. And even when you think there are arguments for them, there's then the question of wisdom. Even if you want to do social relief, is a food bank the best way to do it? There are various arguments that it might not be the best way to do it, but you still believe in relief. What then are we responsible for? What does God ask his people to do in the world? I want to look through some verses, and look, we could spend a long time on this. I've just picked a few key areas. Can I just say, I don't mean to be dismissive or patronizing, but I think when you get into this area, a lot of the arguments for social involvement and social engagement are actually very poor ones. So you read about passages about the Jubilee, or passages like we had in Isaiah 61, set the prisoners free, and so on. Good news for the poor. Oh, we should help the poor then. Food bank. And I've heard many arguments like that, been in circles where that's just kind of accepted. I don't think those are particularly robust arguments when you understand that passage in context. So I'm not going to deal with some of those. I'm not going to deal with what I think are the bad arguments, as it were. And the warning I want to put out is, let's engage with the best arguments. Just because something's argued for badly doesn't mean there isn't a better argument. So I've got a few which I think are some of the strongest that we have to engage with. First of all, we're responsible to show love. Jesus says, of the greatest commandments, the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There's no greater commandment than these. We know the parable of the Good Samaritan, which was around this, love your neighbor. And we know we shouldn't try and justify ourselves like he did by saying, and who's my neighbor? Jonathan Edwards, the New England reformer, wrote a long piece called A Duty of Charity to the Poor, or something like that. And a lot of it is answering objections as to why we shouldn't care for the poor. And he's basically keeps on coming back to, you love your neighbor. And usually objections, he says, are attempts to put limits around that command. Well, we could add Jesus saying, love your enemies. Do good to them and lend to them without expecting anything back. Then your reward will be great and you'll be children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. I take it here then, compared to what we were seeing yesterday, we love our enemies. Those are not people in the church. I know we might feel like some people we might not get on with very well, but that's not who Jesus is thinking of. He's thinking of showing goodness and kindness to those outside and around. And notice the basis of it. It is then that you will be children of the Most High. He doesn't mean adoption. He means imitation. Being a child of is often a kind of an idiom for being like, being in the image of. So you will be like your Father because he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. He gives generously to those who don't say thank you and don't deserve it. So you should give to those who don't deserve it around you. Don't expect anything back. And so there is this stance of love to the world around us. I'll cut to the chase. For us, that verse for me, particularly the second one, is key for how I've thought about this. The church I was pastor of in Cambridge, we had a statement about how we want to show love to the world around us. And that was what was behind things like doing debt counselling and other things. That's how we were framing it in our heads. We want to love people, and here are practical ways to show love. I'll show you my colours. We could go on. We are responsible to reflect God's character. We've just seen that in that previous verse. He's kind, we are to be kind. but other verses would feed into it. Some of the ones, we saw some of these yesterday. God, upholds the cause of the oppressed and gives food to the hungry. He watches over the foreigner and sustains the fatherless and the widow, but frustrates the way of the wicked. This is what God is like. We saw yesterday, if you were here, so his people should be like that in the church, but we can argue, if he's like that, if that's his instinct, his people should reflect that character, that heart. And we would do that in the world. So there's a command to love, there's an expectation to reflect God's character. Then there are these commands to practice justice. Here's an example from Zechariah. This is what the Lord Almighty said: administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. Do not plot evil against each other. And the argument here, and we've seen this a little bit already in these seminars, is that true justice is unpacked in the following commands. True justice is shown by mercy and compassion and not oppressing, and so on. And this, if you read Tim Keller, if you read his book, Generous Justice, this is one of his main arguments. Justice is not simply legal fairness, it is giving what is owed, and we saw some of that in the first session I did. And what is owed might be mercy or compassion. That is what that person is due given their situation. And so some would argue that the commands to simply do justice involve that kind of social involvement. There are arguments against that, but I think some of the next verses actually push it further. These have been quite influential for me. This is from Job. Job is describing himself and how he's lived, and he says, I put on justice, righteousness is my clothing, justice was my robe and my turban. So I've clothed myself with justice. What does that look like? I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I took up the case of the stranger. I broke the fangs of the wicked and snatched the victims from their teeth. So wearing justice meant positive actions of aid and protection of the needy and fighting oppression and so on. You know, that phrase, break the fangs of the wicked and snatch victims, I can't help but think of something like human trafficking. The argument against this would be effectively that this is what would be true within the covenant people. That these commands to justice are to be done within the church. And we agree with that. We saw that yesterday. It's whether you think this extends beyond the church is the main point of debate. Last one I've got on this. What are you responsible for? We're responsible to honor people's value, those made in God's image. Proverbs 14, whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. You see people as made in God's image, and so in caring for them, when you give someone something in need, you say, you're someone made in the image of God, so you have value, and I want to look after you. In doing that, you're honoring God, because they image him. And this is what lay behind many of these historic campaigns I've mentioned, like the campaign against slavery. So look, there are 4 arguments as to what we're responsible for. We can debate them. I'm sorry to be so quick. We've got lots more to cover. You may think some are more persuasive than others. You may hold to some of them or all of them. But if we then come back to our areas of social engagement, you have to decide both which of those you might hold to and then what you think each of them mandates for the church to do or not to do. For example, this is where it gets quite complicated. You could say, well, I think we should show love, And I think we show love by social relief. So tick on the top, show love, tick on social relief, but I'm not so sure about the others. But you might say, I think we should show love, and I think one of the ways we would show love is by social relief, social rehabilitation, and social reform. I want to campaign for a higher living wage because I think that's an act of love to people. So you see the issue. You might hold to one or more of the left-hand reasons. It might justify one or more of the right-hand actions. By and large, the more of the left you hold to, the more of the right you'll do, but it's not as simple as that. Now, I've got a whole variety more things to say, if we have time, but I thought now might be a good time to pause. So, with your neighbour, what do you think we are responsible for? Some people are... Sorry? Who is my neighbour? Let me tell you a parable. What do you think you're responsible for, and what questions do you want to ask from that? Have a chat. It's helpful to have a chat with your neighbour now. Do that. Get on the app. Start sending in your comments, what you think is helpful in that, what you think, like sharing comments in the room, and questions, and we'll get Phil up again in a minute, and we'll go through some of those. Talk to your neighbour for a minute. Okay, let's draw back together. I was helpful to chat a little bit. We primarily have lots of questions. So look, I'll have a go. So we'll work as many as we can now. I'm going to give myself a kind of rough time. I want to say a few more things. Then we'll have, because I want to give us a bit more time for questions later as well. So Phil, hit me.
Let's start with this one. So we had a joke, who's my neighbour? But that is a good question, actually, isn't it? So we live in a highly interconnected world. Everyone could be our neighbour anywhere in the world. We feel we're able to help any given person in some way. So how do we discern who to help without limiting who our neighbour is? And I think related to that, a side question, who are the poor? How poor is poor? How do we discern some of this stuff?
Yeah. See, this is why question answer time's a bad idea, isn't it? Yes, that is a hard question. And we know we're not to kind of go, because they don't live near me, they're not my neighbour, because that's the distancing thing. Yet we cannot make ourselves responsible for every moment of poverty or whatever that we see. It's utterly overwhelming. I do think there is an issue of relational proximity. Who is near me? Physically, relationally. Just to illustrate it, if I knew my neighbour was struggling with something quite minor, they can't mow the lawn anymore, well, it's hardly a disaster. But then I see there's, people starving somewhere else in the world. I don't kind of go, well, I'm not going to care for my neighbour because their need is greater. My neighbour is very close to me, and I want to show love to them. So relational proximity is a principle. But I also think there should be some degree, there shouldn't just be a parochialism that says I'm not bothered about anything anywhere else. And the only way I can suggest churches try and do this is by thinking proximal first, and then who is close to us, who is in our area, who do we know. And even if you don't organise things as a church, I take it the stance we should all have to our neighbours and our work colleagues and those around us is that of love. And you ask, what does that look like? So you could have a lot of social engagement and action at a very organic level, but you then might decide what could we do in our area. We might come back to that. But you may also say, we don't just want to be concerned for, in my case, Cambridge. We want to be concerned elsewhere. Let's pick somewhere else where we know there is great need, where we can get to know that area and we can express concern. It's a little bit like mission. We begin with a relational proximity, but we are also concerned for mission around the world. But you can't just pray for the world. Or you can, but it's not a very helpful thing. It's better to get to know an area of the world and invest in it. So I think there's a parallel there.
So I'm going to group questions together a little bit. So sorry if this kind of dilutes your questions, but it will help us to get through them. So I think a couple of linked questions here about the role of government, a benefit system, those kind of things, how do they impact what we do as churches when there is kind of state intervention?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's recognize that, the kind of welfare system in this country is a very Christian-inspired thing, that we should care for the poor. That is not the case in countries with a less Christian influence. When you look at, it's interesting to look at the Old Testament laws in areas about the poor and caring for the poor, and you think, well, that was functioning at a sort of it's the covenant community and the nation state in one go. What we have is the nation state providing some kind of level of care. I don't know if this is helpful. The one thing this has made me think is I should think about my taxes differently. I should give my taxes willingly and in a sense generously, thinking this is caring for needy people around me. And that's a good thing. If I think I should be doing that, give my money to that. If not, I'll be begrudging. And so we recognize that and we celebrate that and we say, I think we say that's a good thing. I mean, I know there are all manner of issues within our welfare. I'm not suggesting it's a good system. Please don't think that. But that it exists at all is a good thing. The question then is, what does the church do, if anything, in addition? And one thing, I think, one thing many churches do is help people make the most of the welfare system, because actually they can't work it very well. And it's there, so let's do that. But then there will often be additional things to do.
There's a few questions along this kind of theme. So this one's had the most votes and it's helpful. There's a few others along a similar theme. If not every command is given to the church, example, the church doesn't have to be a good husband to my wife, how do we tell the difference between the mission of the local church and the mission of individual Christians?
Yeah, I'll come back to that. We'll come to that.
I'm a bit later on. Okay, that means I've got to then think on my feet and go to a different question. We had this one yesterday, so we want to come back to because we said ask it today, and you have done. So here it is. Is pursuing justice a New Testament category? It's clearly present in the Old Testament, but the emphasis in the New Testament seems more about loving neighbour and not showing favouritism, etc. Is Paul's command to Timothy to pursue righteousness related to justice?
Very good question. So there are no New Testament commands. Go and do justice, as it were. In the same way, there are Old Testament commands. I think, the command is to show love. I think that's right, and that's why, for example, at our church, it's not that we don't believe anything. It's not that we're saying we don't think we should do any kind of justice, but in getting a church to sign up to something, this is part of our church promise. I would feel most confident about saying we promise we will try and love the world around us. Because I think I can point to verses on that. And if I said we promise to do social justice, that would just raise so many questions. It would be unhelpful, I think. So I would happily speak of the language of love more kind of positively. But I don't think Old Testament commands are simply dismissed because they're not repeated in the New Testament. And, as we saw yesterday, all of the commands in the Old Testament are summed up in the command to love. So doing justice in the Old Testament is seen in loving people. And so when I say love people, I can reverse engineer that and say, well, loving people may well be seen in justice.
A couple of people have quoted Psalm 146. So we seek a distinction between meeting needs of the oppressed, hungry, etc., and frustrating the ways of the wicked in God's character. That's Psalm 146, verses 7 and 9.
Which I quoted, yeah.
Okay. How do we reflect this? How should this distinction inform our practice? Doesn't that argue for social reform of structures? How do we do some of that?
Yes, if you follow that character argument and you say God upholds the cause of the oppressed, and you say that extends beyond the church, so I want to reflect that in society, yes, you are now very firmly in social justice territory. What you have to do is to ask, well, who are the oppressed? And what does oppression look like now in our society? And I'm not trying to fudge it. I'm just saying that is just a very involved question. But you want to wrestle with that, and you want to engage with that. So when I say if you think, I'm not saying I don't think. What I'm trying to do here is to be helpfully objective in helping you think it through, rather than just going, yes, that's true, you ought. I'm trying to avoid that. That's why I'm couching my language.
Can you show us some of your working? So what we mean by this is, can you show the hermeneutical principles that, it's jumped up the screen. Can you show the hermeneutical principles that lead to applying instructions for justice within Israel's borders to issues beyond the church?
Yes. So I do think the vast majority of commands to do with justice amongst God's people in the Old Testament apply to within the church. So I think there we are on very firm territory. That was yesterday's seminar, if you were here. The hermeneutical principles would run like, again, I'll say this is what they are in terms of what people argue. You'll have to decide what you think. Some would say those principles apply to the church, and because they are a reflection of God's character. They are, of course, what we do in the church because that's where we see it, but because we reflect his character, we're like that to others as well. Like a father tries to care for his children. He deals with people outside his family differently, but he doesn't become a different person, and so the same instincts, values, so on would be expressed. That would be probably the main argument, I think. The other one would be things like those verses from Job, saying that if I put on justice as my garment, I wear those clothes everywhere, not just in the church. And that would involve breaking the fangs and so on. Those would be the two key things.
Obviously, we all have limited resources, time, money. Any investment in social justice issues could or will take resources away from our primary mission of gospel proclamation.
Yeah.
How do we guard against this? What's that balance look like?
I'm going to come back to that. And let's stop there because we need to move on.
Thank you. Sorry, so many questions. Thank you.
We'll have some more questions at the end, but it'd be good to touch on some of those things that have just been raised that I said I'd come back to and say a few more things. Thank you for so many great questions. Let's move on to a few more things. And I'm going to be quicker now. I just want to map out some of the territory for you in helping you think it through. What is being achieved in whatever it is you're running? Christians Against Poverty, you're running a pregnancy counselling centre, you're signing a campaign. What do you think is being achieved? That's an interesting question because it frames what you think you're doing in the world. And so you're saying something about what the church is supposed to be up to. You might say, love is being expressed. This is an expression of our love for people reflecting God's love. Great. You might say, people are being cared for, needs are being met. Great. You might say, the kingdom is coming. The kingdom is being built. We're fulfilling the Lord's Prayer, may your kingdom come. Some would say in justice being achieved in society, God's rule is being established. You might say we are reweaving society. And I put that in inverted commas and use that phrase because it's a phrase from Tim Keller, and he's the person you're most likely to have read on this. Other descriptions under that heading would be things like bringing shalom into the world, God's kind of harmony, or restoring creation in some way, or redeeming creation. And I hope you see as we're going down that list, it's not quite increasing, but there's a kind of, I think I'm doing a lot more by the bottom than I'm just showing love. And that maps onto, again, it's complicated, it's not a simple mapping, but it maps onto some of our areas from earlier. If you think you're expressing love and people are being cared for, you will probably operate in relief and rehabilitation more because you want to meet this need. You want to help this person get back on their feet in their life, and you're doing it as an expression of love and care of the church. If you think the kingdom is coming and that our society is being reweaved, you probably may do some rehabilitation, but you'll certainly be doing more reform. So it's not a simple mapping. You might justify reform, as I said earlier, as an expression of love, for example. But by and large, the fuller your picture of what you think you're doing in the world, the more you'll operate at the kind of more institutional reform level. So what do you think is being achieved? Then to come to one of the questions that was just asked, what is the connection to evangelism? And we could kind of add to discipleship. We know this is what the church should be doing. But there's been particular debate about how social action and justice of any kind connects to evangelism. Some have said they are kind of equivalent. Social justice is evangelism. And I take it we disagree with that. Let me tell you, you should disagree with that. I'm trying to be objective and careful in lots of my language. I won't be there. That's wrong. I say it because it has been said in some of this literature, evangelism is the hearing of the gospel, not the caring of needs. Some, though, have made them equal partners. People have spoken of the two sides to mission. Various analogies have been used: two wings to a bird, two blades to a pair of scissors, and so you must have both. Without it, it just won't work, as it were. And they are therefore as important as each other. And some people were nervous about some of the Lausanne Covenant stuff because it seemed to land in that kind of territory. It depends quite how you read it, but it kind of could land there. A lot of people have said that they are unequal or asymmetric in some way. And this is probably where most of us would land. Let me give you some options. Some would talk in terms of priority. So the gospel, evangelism, is a greater priority, but we still do care for people. I think that's true. I don't want to affirm that. I don't know how helpful it is, because if something's a priority and there's lots of it to do you ever get to lesser priorities? There are things on my to-do list I never get to because they're not at the top. Others have spoken of them as unequal but inseparable. That's Keller's phrasing. So that they're unequal in that the gospel is more important than this. It's more important people hear the gospel than their needs are cared for. Very clear. But they are inseparable in that we must still do this. So I don't just get a pass on that. Whereas the priority language could make me think, well, if I do the priority, then I may not have to do that. The third phrasing or framing of it has been about what is central and what is kind of contextual. So what's at the very center, the bullseye, and what's in the surround. And Tim Chester and some of his work has spoken of this. The gospel is central. It is our focus. But we always speak the gospel in a context. William Booth. I'm trying to speak the gospel to people who need soup and soap as well as salvation. So the gospel is what I want to do, but because that's my context, I'm going to include soup and soap. But it may be you're talking to someone for whom soup and soap is not an issue and you're just telling them the gospel. So your context then determines what it looks like. But it's a context where you say, I want to express love and care or reweave society or whatever it is you think is happening, and what that will look like will depend on the context. And so we therefore expect quite a lot of variety amongst us, not just for different positions, because of different contexts. Personally, I find that third one quite a helpful way of thinking and a way of trying to keep the mission of the church in evangelism and discipleship central, but because we are holistic, we care for people. To put it slightly different, so there's one quote going around on this you may have come across. I can't remember who said it. When you say the priorities of evangelism, you might just say, our mission is to save souls. And someone's quip back, it was to say, yes, but I tend to find souls come attached to bodies. In other words, as I meet this person, I do so in a certain context, and I may want to care for them in certain ways. Then who is responsible? Is it the church? Does the church organize this sort of care? Or is the church's mission evangelism and discipleship? Let's run through the options and I'll explain some of the other issues. Could it then be that individuals do this as part of their own discipleship in whatever context they're in? Or is it that you set up some parachurch organization? Now, I've already said, I think some of it would obviously operate at the individual level. I take it I would argue our stance should at the very least be that of love and care to those around us, and there will be an organic way in which that will work out. But there will then be a limit to what individuals can achieve. So if you were in a deprived area, and if you thought that some kind of budgeting advice or debt counselling or some kind of organised care or rehabilitation or something would be a good thing, it's very hard to say to an individual, you do that, you set that up. So what tends to then happen is either it goes to the church to set up, because now the church can organise things more, or if you say, no, the church shouldn't be doing it, you have to set up a parachurch thing. The downside, potentially, of the church thing, and here I think we're in wisdom territory more than we are right-wrong, but some people think there are right-wrongs in here. I think one of the downsides of the church doing it is the church could get distracted. Suddenly you're running all sorts of other things that are taking over. The upside is it is the church showing care as the church, and it's all part of the church's mission. We did CAP debt counselling and life skills courses and jobs clubs, and we went, we had lunch and then we had a Bible study. Because it's the church running it, and we can do that sort of thing. The parachurch allows the removing of it from the church structure. The pastor and the elders don't have to worry about it because it's being run over there. And that's got an advantage. And you may read Tim Keller on setting up kind of what we'd call NGOs, charitable institutions and so on, to run things. The downside is it's now detached from the church. I've got to keep going. There are more things to think about, I'm afraid. What are some of the wider connections? This is my last bit. And I want to throw out a few other areas just to kind of be aware of in mapping the territory. Let me just say something about social justice. We commented at the start on this. And that rise of social justice and what we think of it, that is a seminar in itself. Let me just pick up one element, okay? Just one element, and that is that of systems and institutions. Did you notice when I went back to the social gospel, that was one of the new things, that there is institutional sin of some kind. And that's a key element in the modern social justice movement. The problem is located in systems more than individuals. So there is then talk of something like systemic racism. And many evangelicals have pushed back on that, and they've said, no, the problem in the world is because of sin. Racism is a problem, and it's a sin problem, and individuals sin. Institutions don't sin. Institutions don't have wills, and so on. I think it's worth just picking that apart slightly. If you say that there is systemic racism in an organization, what do people mean? They might simply mean racism is very common. Lots of people are racist. They might then mean racism is kind of assumed within the culture, and as a result goes unchallenged. A racist decision is made or a racist view is expressed and nobody raises an issue. They might mean the actual system, depends what it is, the police, the welfare system, whatever, the actual system and the decisions it makes and the actions it engages in are racist. Now, clearly that can happen. Apartheid in South Africa. I take it we think the system can discriminate unfairly. In our country, I presume it's not a case of, look, there are simply blatantly unjust laws like that. It becomes more a combination of factors. The welfare system where someone doesn't quite tick the right boxes and as a result doesn't get the care you think they ought to get, for example. It seems to me that there can be truth in all of those. It can be a common thing, it can be an assumed cultural thing, it can actually get embedded in a system that is then perpetuated. The solution of the social justice kind of analysis is then poor, because it's all about overthrowing systems and so on. But there can be truth in the description, and I think we should be alert to that. That's just one thing on social justice. There's lots more we could talk about there. Very briefly, eschatology. For some of these systems, just your wider theology starts to play out. You may know of different millennial positions. Post-millennial, for example, sees Jesus as reigning in society more and more and more. As we move forward in history, Jesus' reign will extend further and further. And that will often go hand in hand with the kingdom is coming in society. Whereas other eschatology systems see the church as this sort of embattled minority against an increasingly hostile culture, in which case you're probably not going to think we're changing society. We're just holding out. Other eschatology things will see our efforts in culture as effectively building the kingdom. What we do here and now will last into the future. That's a very debated area, but that's what some would say. And if so, you think, of course we try and bring shalom now. But if you don't think that is how eschatology works, that won't be an argument in your thinking. So I'm just putting it on your radar. I'm not going to do a seminar on the millennium at this point. Christ and culture. You may know some of the different models of how Christ fits with a secular culture. There are different paradigms about Christ kind of being seen in culture, transforming culture, Christ against culture, and so on. What position you have on that, that's a step back from this issue and a more your general stance towards the culture around you. And then lastly, kingdom theology. How does Jesus reign over the church and how does he reign over the world? In the theology track happening at the same time right now, the thing they're discussing is this, specifically is to do with two kingdom theology from David Van Drunen, that you make a distinction between Jesus' reign over the church and his reign over the world. And depending how you configure that, can then also have an impact on how you think Jesus brings his reign and whether you should work for his reign over society or not. Again, I'm not trying to explain it, I'm just trying to make you alert to it. There we go. I hope that's helpful to map some of the territory with your neighbour for a moment. What does that look like for you? What changes might you want to consider or what you might want to do? I'm afraid lunch is in 4 minutes. So I'll tell you what I'll do. A couple of minutes with your neighbour. I'll check with Phil. If there's a top question on the app, I'll have a go. Is that a deal? Go for it. Okay. Phil tells me that the plan for lunch is the same as yesterday in that we will be in quite long queues. If you want to get into that queue, it's 1 minute to go. Please, seriously, feel very free to leave at this stage. But Phil tells me that if we leave here in 5 or 10 minutes, we'll just be a bit further back in the queue. You're not going to miss lunch. So he said, don't worry about finishing at 1:15. Your hands, what do you do with yourself? Phil, give us a question.
I just thought we may as well chat in here rather than in the queue for lunch. That was my thinking, but there we are. So when it comes to social, I think Tom means social reform rather than social rehabilitation. The most effective examples, as far as I can see, were yielded by Christian politicians. So you referenced Wilberforce, Shaftesbury, etc., not by churches. Should that shape whether churches prioritise this activity? And I guess how should they, if at all?
Yeah, thank you. So in that, in relieving need and some form of rehabilitation, you can see what the church could do. In terms of social reform, absolutely, the most effective examples we can cite would be where there has been reform of society because of reform of our laws. And we have to be honest and just say, well, what could a local church do? I mean, some things might fit more locally, issues around, I don't know, local policing or something, where you could talk to your local council or something. So a church could campaign for some sort of societal reform at the local level, but at the national level, it has to be national reform. The government has to be involved in some way. And so if you think that's something that we ought to prioritize, then we should be backing and supporting that, praying for, I take it, the most effective thing would be Christian politicians, and praying for people to be in that world and helping them, seeing that as their ministry, helping and supporting and cheering them on in that.
This is an interesting question. How do we balance the fact that there are some issues only the church cares about and some that already have plenty of resources and support from the world? Should that mean we prioritise the less supported causes?
Yeah, that's a great comment, and I think off the top of my head it would be yes. I remember one church I know asking the question, how do we show love and care for those around us? The first thing they did was set up a pregnancy counselling centre. Speak up for those who can't speak up for themselves, says Proverbs. Protect the rights of people. Let's start with the unborn and try and care for them because no one else is doing that before we do debt and so on. Now, the caveat I would add is if that kind of centre and context is helpful, what's my context, therefore what would be best done here? But to ask the question, what isn't being done here by the welfare system, for example, would be a good thing to ask.
Some Christian organisations speak of seeking to eradicate certain issues, so make poverty history, for example. Is that a good or realistic goal, given Jesus' words and what will come?
Yeah, so by Jesus' words, you probably know it's in Mark 14, you'll always have the poor among you. So we will not make poverty history. We will not make injustice end. That is like saying we will end sin in the world. So no. But can there be moments where societies are fairer and better and people are cared for more? Yes, absolutely. They can be. They may last for a while. They may slide back. This comes back slightly to what you think is being achieved. If you're expressing love and caring for people, you think that's a good thing to do, in a sense, whether that results in lasting reform or not. If you think the kingdom's coming, then you think, well, the kingdom has come. Maybe it slid back a bit, but it was still meaningful in what happened. And maybe you tie it with your eschatology and you see all of that as adding to where Jesus is taking the world. But no, we will never actually end any of this.
How do we discern the role of the local church when it comes to doing something and signposting to something else? So, i.e. debt support. You could do it yourself or you could signpost. What does discerning look like there? Yeah,
well, I think we're in wisdom territory there. You may decide, look, you may decide that I don't think we should run debt counselling, or it may be you just simply can't run debt counselling, but the Citizens Advice Bureau does it, or someone else does it. And one of the ways you'll care for people is by signposting. But I also want to add to that, it's not just going, oh, you've got a problem, go over there. Let me take you over there. Let me walk through this with you. In other words, if what I want to do is to love you, but I haven't got the resources, I'm going to love you by helping you access them and walk, etc.
We find it hard to be distinctive in a town where lots of unbelievers are already doing good things. So what can we do to be distinctive where secular groups are already doing good things somewhere?
I don't think I'd worry too much about that. Seriously, I mean, if secular groups are doing good things, great. That's good.
Go and get involved.
Perhaps I could get involved with what they're doing. It would depend how it's being done, etc. So there'd be questions to ask. But a lot of the instincts, and John said this earlier, didn't he? I think a lot of the instincts around social justice today are kind of warped or twisted or something versions of a Christian truth, of wanting to see justice and fairness and care and so on. They're kind of a Christian inheritance. And so I'm not against them, and I don't have to kind of go, no, we have to do it better than you. I think we will do it better in various ways, but I don't want to say I've got to set myself in competition and make myself stand out. I wouldn't worry about that question. I just want to ask, what do I think our church ought to do?
Finally then, what resources, pop level, for church members on this issue would you recommend? You've mentioned Generous Justice by Tim Keller, that's perhaps more at a leader level. Are there other resources you'd recommend?
Yeah, in terms of books, I guess Tim Keller's Generous Justice would be the fullest argument for a lot of this. On the other side, if you read something like The Mission of the Church by DeYoung and Gilbert, that they're not against what I've perhaps have called a sort of a stance of love and care. They are worried about distraction and thinking you're achieving things you're not, and so on. So if you want to read something on the other side, The Mission of the Church, I think would be very helpful. Those are both more involved reads. I'm afraid I can't think of something at a very popular level in terms of reading. What you then tend to get are groups that are doing something, like Christians Against Poverty, for example. Those groups, whichever area it is, have obviously decided this is what we think we ought to do. Yeah, and so once you connect with them, it's almost like you're now into practicalities, and the reasoning is all assumed. And sometimes with those groups, the reasoning isn't great. I'm afraid. I think. We've been involved with Christians Against Poverty. I think they've been great in lots of ways. I think unfortunately, I've heard some, quite poor arguments, but I've said to my church, I think there are better arguments for why we might do this and how we might do it. And just to say, one thing to be very aware of is in connecting with other groups that will help resource you to do any of this, a key issue is how much they will, if I can put it this way, dictate to you as to how you'll do it and how much freedom they'll give you. So again, just use the example of Christians Against Poverty. We had resources and skill set and so on, but we can decide if we run a Bible study. We can decide if we invite people to church, and we can decide how we present it all. That's all in our hands. And I quite like that. You're giving us a way of doing things. We're deciding how we're actually going to run it on the ground. Other groupings, there may not be that kind of flexibility. So that's just for leaders, that's an issue in deciding who you're going to get involved in and how it might work.
I think we should end there, owing to the fact that we're 10 minutes over. But thank you, Graham.
Let me pray. Father, thank you for the chance to think together. I'm unsure what to say because I don't want to put words into people's mouths, but we want to, I take it, express love and justice rightly in our world. And we pray for each of us, you would help us reflect on that, what that should look like. And you'd help us embody that and live that out in our contexts. Would you lead us and guide us and aid us in this? Ultimately, that you and the Lord Jesus will be glorified. And we ask in his name. Amen. Thank you, guys.